So this completes Topic 1 in Define. Welcome to Topic 2, Voice of the Customer. Now, our customers are the most important part of any business. A customer is defined as someone who decides to purchase, pay for a product or service, or consumes a product or service, or in some way gets affected by a particular product or service that we produce. There are two types of customers, internal and external. Being able to identify your customers is important when trying to understand their requirements so that the product or service can be designed according to their requirements. An internal customer is anyone who is within the business system and is affected by the product or service while it's still in development. They are typically internal to the process or organization, so they work for your company. Now, internal customers have needs that need to be addressed. They may need necessary tools, training, and instructions. They may need additional awards or recognition. The satisfaction levels of internal customers can be improved in various ways, but increasing communication, awarding, and continuous training and cultivating a competitive environment are some great examples to do that. Going back to our example in our call center, an internal customer could be the actual employee that is receiving customer calls. It could be the HR generalist or the recruiter who hires them. Or it could be the director of the call center. Now, an external customer is not part of your organization, so they're outside of it. However, they are still impacted by it. They are the source of revenue for any business system and therefore incredibly important. Now, external customers can be defined in three different ways. We have intermediate customers, we have end users, and we have affected parties. Now, an intermediate customer is the middleman. They're going to purchase a product or service, then they're going to modify it, and then resell that product or service to the end user. While the end user purchases a product or service for their own personal use. And then finally, affected parties are those who don't purchase the product but are impacted by it. One important aspect of any process improvement project is how it affects your customers, both internal customers and external. Now, internal customers are going to be affected by increased motivation and job satisfaction, while external customers see solutions to problems, better products, and improved services and customer satisfaction. Collecting data from customers is essential. It helps us consider levels at which these customers impact the business. Now, customer feedback is collected from both internal and external sources. And we collect customer feedback to fill gaps and to improve various business processes within our organization. We do it to define a good quality product as perceived by the customer, to identify qualities that make the competitor's product or service better than our own, and then to identify the factors that provide us a competitive advantage to our product and service. So let's review something called the customer proximity scale. So we have our scale, and our scale goes from low to high. And it's low proximity or further away from the customer, and then we move up the scale to where we get closer to the actual customer. The reason why we are putting all of these things on a proximity scale is because the closer we get to the customer, the easier it is for us to hear their voice. This is where voice of the customer becomes very important. So it begins low on the scale with market research. Now, market research is very distilled and furthest away from the actual customer. Some examples of market research would be company SEC or Securities and Exchange information. So we're just looking at their annual reports, for instance, or maybe their quarterly reports. Maybe we're getting information about the company or about the customer experience from industry experts. Or perhaps maybe even from secondary data like websites or something like that. We get a little bit closer to the customer in these items called listening posts. Now, there's really three main ones, and the first one is complaints. It's a great way for a customer to communicate with a company. by complaining about the product. The problem with that is we never hear any of the good stuff that the customers give us. We only hear what's wrong. Especially if you work in a contact center or a customer call center, they never hear a customer call in and say, hey, you're doing such a great job. Instead, they only hear about how it's causing the customer pain. And that brings us to two ways that we get that information. We get it from customer service reps and we get that from sales reps. The problem with getting our voice of the customer directly from our employees is that there's a form of bias that's inherent to that. Since customer service reps only hear complaints, that's pretty much what we're going to hear from them. And since sales reps are really only caring about making the next sale, we're only going to hear about that. The best way to gain your voice of the customer is through something called customer research methods, which is the most intimate and closest we can get to the customer. And there's 4 ways that we can do this. We can do it through general observation, we can do it through interviews, through focus groups, or through surveys. Now, surveys are probably the most popular way to get voice of the customer information. Everything you buy, every website you go to, every phone call you make to a credit card company or to a business is going to ask you to complete a survey. The problem with surveys is generally it only provides about a 30% response rate. So you're not even getting 70% of the information that you're really needing. In surveys, on top of that, the reason why that the response rate is so low is because the vast majority of people will only give a survey if they're in the bottom 25% in terms of their experience, so they're not really happy with it, or if they're in the top 25% of their experience, or they're incredibly happy with it. If your experience falls within that middle 50%, odds are you're not going to fill out the survey. The next one that we could do is focus groups. Now, focus groups is one thing that I absolutely adore to do. I think focus groups give you a great amount of information. Not only are you able to hear from actual customers or employees or stakeholders, but you can also drive that conversation to get very particular or specific information. Focus groups are critical to any particular process. Interviews are another great way. It's a one-on-one interaction between you and that stakeholder. It allows you to come with a predefined set of questions, driving and looking for a predefined solution or answer. Observations are also key. By watching the customer or the stakeholder interact with the product or service and seeing how they react to it, see how they are able to interact with it, and see how they are using the product or service is incredible and very valuable information. So you don't have to choose one or the other. You can choose many of these. It doesn't really matter which one you choose. But we want to make sure that we're looking at the information that's at the highest proximity or the closest to the customer, because that's where the true voice of the customer is going to come into play. And this is a great example of a proximity scale.